Uh, just to introduce myself briefly first, for those of you who I've not met, my name is Ella Frankel. I'm the Senior Advisor, Food, Farming and Fisheries at ETI, the Ethical Trading Initiative. And we are very glad that you've been able to join us today to talk about buying responsibly in supply chains in Southern Europe, specifically looking at Spain, research we've done in Spain and Italy, fresh produce and ambient supply chains. To give some context for those who are not familiar with some of our work, we've been working on purchasing practices for several years now across numerous different supply chains, and we've been doing work in Southern Europe agriculture for over a decade, supporting supply chain and workers to ensure access to and enjoyment of decent work and access to rights across the region. From 2023, ETI worked on a project called Grievance Mechanisms Agriculture, which hopefully lots of you are familiar with, where we worked specifically to understand the barriers and challenges to access effective grievance mechanisms, primarily for migrant workers in Spain and Italy, fresh produce and ambient supply chains. And as part of that project, we undertook several exercises, both in terms of looking at grievance mechanism structures specifically, but also in trying to understand the commercial dynamics and realities in which those supply chains operate, and trying to understand how the commercial dynamics in the sector impact on working conditions and supply chain resilience as a whole. So we are very pleased to share some of that learning with you today. I will briefly touch on some housekeeping. Yeah, we ask that if you can please put your name and organization in your Zoom tag so that we all know who's here. We will be monitoring the chat box, so please put in any questions that you have for any of the speakers or ETI, and we will get back to you. There'll be an opportunity for Q&A, but we can try and answer as we go. And please do try and have your cameras on if it's possible during plenary and discussion elements of this session. We'll be with you for about an hour and a half. If you need to stretch your legs, get a cup of water, please feel free to do so. We don't have any specific break planned in the agenda. So onto the agenda then, I will shortly be passing over to Hilary, who will talk us through the report. We'll then go through a panel discussion, an opportunity for you to ask some Q&A, and then we have some time for you to discuss amongst yourself and try and draw out some of the technical and interesting detail from the report as you engage with one another. If we go to the next slide, please. I think with that then, I will pass over to Hilary Murdoch, who will present a summary of the findings and recommendations of the research and report that will be published shortly by ETI. Hilary is the consultant who undertook the research and who wrote the report together with a handful of ETI members. For those who haven't met Hilary, and I think several of you probably have, but Hilary is a supply chain human rights expert who's been working in the field for 25 years and has worked on various projects with us at ETI and also with many of our members, both in food and in garment supply chains, and is specifically focused on supporting brands and retailers to work in partnership with suppliers to make practical improvements to working conditions in the relevant supply chains. As I mentioned, Hilary's done a lot of work on responsible practices over the last few years, both with the ILO and with ETI, and facilitates the Responsible Purchasing Practices Working Group, which ETI is a member of. So a massive thank you to Hilary for all the effort in undertaking the research, which is very comprehensive, and I'm looking forward to all of you being able to read it. And with that, Hilary, I will pass over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ella. Lovely to be here. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. So, purchasing practices. What are we talking about in terms of purchasing practices? It's basically everything that happens to purchase something. So everything that's involved in buying a product or service, it could be the relationship with the suppliers, the product development, planning, forecasting, critical path management, contracts, order placement, lead times, cost pricing, and payment terms. And responsible purchasing practices is very simply doing those practices in a way that doesn't negatively impact human rights of workers in supply chains. So, what could be the possible impact of purchasing practices? Well, if we've got poor communication, changing orders at the last minute, sharp increases in orders without warning, then that can squeeze the amount of time available for suppliers to make products. logical, right? But that actually can have a massive impact on workers. So, excessive overtime, nighttime work, no rest days, exhausted workers, more injuries. And I've talked to workers in production sites where they've said, when we get a rushed order, we get sweared at, we get shouted at. It's so much more stressful, and it's a really horrible environment when that happens. It also means that there's an increased dependency on temporary and migrant workers, which who often have fewer rights, and often that kind of dependency with the short-term changes in orders increases the power, so to speak, of those who might control the temporary workers. So it increases their vulnerability in those circumstances. It also sometimes means there's spot purchasing to unauthorized sites, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. And the end result of that is also business risks, both for the supplier and for the retailers and buyers. Possible disruption of supply, poor relationship with suppliers, and working conditions ultimately that aren't in line with the retailers or the buyer's own human rights standards. So the impact of purchasing practices, if suppliers are accepting low prices and potentially even below the cost of production, I've talked to a lot of suppliers who've said, we are consistently sometimes having to agree to prices below the actual cost it costs us to produce this thing, which is like crazy in terms of sustainability of supply, right? If we want sustainable and stable supply into the future, we can't have businesses selling stuff for less than the price it costs them to make it. It's just not sustainable. So sometimes people are trying to pitch a price just to keep the business that is actually really on the edge of what it's actually costing them to make. But if they are agreeing to these low prices, that is affecting wages for workers, but also affecting their ability to invest in health and safety and well-being of workers. And also it's affecting the resilience of supply, the stability of these businesses to be able to supply in the future. Often significant financial loss if they produce more than they sell. Cancelling or significantly reducing orders can result in retrenchment or even site closure. And a key issue that we'll talk about later is with long payment terms, suppliers are having to pay out for inputs, wages, and overheads months and months before they receive the actual payment, which means financial instability for them, an imbalance of risk. But on the more positive side, if communication is good and there's honesty encouraged, that means there's greater commitment from suppliers and performance. And if supplier businesses receive lead times that are feasible, this means that there's resilience and sustainability in the supply chain, reducing the risk of supply interruptions. And ultimately, if we all know this, if working conditions are good, if workers are happier, if they're pleased to be there, they are more productive, quality increases, accidents reduce, worker turnover reduces, and that all is good for that supplier business to be stable in terms of their supply. So, a bit of background for this particular report and research is that there is a document called the Common Framework for Responsible Purchasing Practices. If you're interested in purchasing practices, I really recommend you read this as a kind of baseline document of what do we define responsible purchasing practices as. I supported the RPP working group to develop the original document of this in textiles in 2022, then worked with the ETI to develop a food version of this. Basically, this document, the food version, is a general one for the food sector. And the idea is that more detailed guidance will be produced for different categories later. And in that vein, we wanted to kind of dive into the fresh produce and ambient sector within Italy and Spain. So here's an overview of the 5 principles. I won't talk about them in detail, but really recommend, if you haven't read that document, to have a look at that. It gives a very good overview of what we're talking about here. So the report that we're talking about today followed these 5 sections in terms of its structure. So what's the background to this report and research? As Ella mentioned, it was focused on the supply chains relevant to the grievance mechanisms in agriculture GMA group. So that's why we focused on Italy and Spain, fresh produce and ambient. And three members of that group volunteered to kind of dive into a bit deeper discussion on these topics. One European supermarket, one UK supermarket, and one tier one supplier. So myself and also Kate Robinson, another consultant, did supplier interviews in Italy and Spain, fresh produce and ambient. And then what we did was reported those interviews and those findings aggregated and anonymously. So people really were very honest in their feedback because they knew it was going to be anonymous. Then we supported those three ETI members to have internal workshops with their buying teams to kind of really flesh out what are the current purchasing practices and what are some of the pressure points that we suspect could maybe be having a risk of impact, negative impact on suppliers and workers. Then we worked together as a group to come up with recommendations in each of these 5 areas and then had a wider review of the report. So let's dive in. We're going to have a little brief explanation of the findings and recommendations in each of these sections. So in terms of the first one, which is internal integration, what did suppliers think? Well, they did talk about a lack of alignment between commercial and human rights sustainability teams. So kind of being pulled in 2 different directions by the 2 different teams within one company. They also talked about potentially when there's recruitment of young, inexperienced buyers or particularly they talked about quick changeover of buyers between categories. It's meaning that procurement teams are not building up the category knowledge, which would mean that there's a more knowledge-based, reasonable-based negotiation of cost, understanding the real cost of production because of that experience. So the buyer perspectives, they were like, yes, definitely within companies, people do work in silos. And they also agreed and acknowledged that buying teams at the moment primarily are incentivized by margin and on-time delivery, which does mean that some of the human rights elements are kind of potentially sidelines in those commercial decisions because it's not part of incentives. So what were the recommendations in this first section? A really key one here is aligning internal processes, decision-making and communication between those different teams, between the commercial teams and the sustainability teams, increasing regular communication and collaboration and integrating those decision-making and those targets. Building the category knowledge of buyers and allowing them to remain in a category longer. And a key element here is really thinking about how buyers are incentivized and making sure that accountability, how they're reviewed, even in an annual review of their job, is not just on margin and on-time delivery, that it includes elements of responsible purchasing practices. It includes elements of the way that they actually buy and how that could impact suppliers. For example, the length of relationship with suppliers. Also, a key element here is training commercial teams on responsible purchasing practices. The next element here, principle 3 in the common framework, is buyer-supplier relationships. From the supplier perspective, a really key element here is agreements and commitments that are only for one season. Suppliers were talking about that means that they cannot make investments such as planting new varieties or improving labour conditions with confidence that they have the financial stability to step into those commitments and decisions. And a really big thing, every single supplier that we spoke to talked about this, was that labour and environmental requirements are overly burdensome. That there is like a plethora of requests, there's a plethora of repeated but slightly different requests, which is just draining unnecessary levels of time and resources. But I think a key element here was where they are really working hard on these elements, they aren't rewarded in actual commercial terms. So they make a massive effort to meet these requirements, and then the retailer changes for a few pence in a tender to someone else who's not doing those things. So that's a disincentive to really be working hard on these things. In terms of buyer perspectives, this is something we explore more in the report, so do have a read. A lot of buyers were saying they are moving towards more longer term relationships. So they might have multiple years of relationships with one supplier, but they still only have 1 year contracts. So that's an interesting dynamic there. Recommendations were that there's more two-way communication and open dialogue. So not just requests in one direction, but also really listening. What are the challenges you're facing? Is there anything that we can do together to work on that? So more frequent communication, maybe more video calls rather than just email communication, and particularly focusing on strategic and high-risk, human rights high-risk suppliers on that. Moving towards longer term contracts, where possible, is a big recommendation in this section and something that is hugely, hugely significant and important. And some UK supermarkets are working towards this, particularly with their UK supply chains. There's a few case studies in the report on that. But also building those long-term relationships and having joint problem solving, especially when there is weather crises. Reducing the compliance and audit burden. And really key element here is incentivizing human rights improvements and performance with real business benefits, not just an award or recognition, but actually giving genuine business benefits for those who make good improvements, for example, longer contracts. So the next element here is production planning and ordering. So what did the suppliers think? This is a very interesting thing that is quite specific to this supply chain, is about labour challenges that appear on the edge of seasons. So basically in the middle of the season, the weather is pretty steady, they're harvesting a lot and the labour is there and the orders are there. Whereas on the edge of the seasons, it's harder to predict fluctuating weather. The labour is maybe not always there if the labour comes for a particular season. In terms of migrant labour, but also the demand is fluctuating because the weather in the UK or wherever the purchases are is also fluctuating. So it's harder to predict the needs for labour in those spaces in the edge of seasons, and it's also harder to get the labour. So in those sort of edge of season times, it's a kind of that brings a risk of more vulnerable groups or potentially spot purchasing from less known places in terms of confidence in terms of working conditions. Waste. This was something that quite a lot of suppliers mentioned, particularly the UK. They felt that the UK was stricter on this than European retailers, being very strict on the requirements in terms of size of produce, which results in a lot of unnecessary waste and financial loss. Last minute order changes put pressure on working conditions. Suppliers were reporting that changes could be made to the volume order right up until 24 hours before shipping. If you imagine you're sourcing from many, many different growers, and right 24 hours before you're supposed to ship, it jumps up. And when that demand goes up, there's often spot purchasing, which means that there's uncertain origin and labour standards if they're pulling in on additional sites in a panic at the last minute. Buyer perspectives, they agreed and reported those short lead times for fresh. It's 2 to 3 days, or day 1 for day 5, but not less than 24 hours. And we had quite an interesting discussion with the buyers about, but if you ask a supplier, is this lead time okay? And they say it's okay, then it must be okay. But interestingly, how those discussions work is that they're maybe talking to an exporter or a cooperative in that group. That person who's in sales in the cooperative may not know the detail of the impact of the workers on the ground by them saying yes to that very short lead time. And in terms of spot purchasing, the buyers were saying, yes, but when we do spot purchasing, if they do spot purchasing, it's supposed to be from approved sites. But the reality may be that because of the power dynamic, the supplier doesn't feel they can say no. And it may be that they are purchasing from non-approved sites because they feel they can't say no. And the requirements on size and shape, we know about some of the major retailers that have these kind of imperfect ranges, wonky vegetables, and all of these things. But actually, the interesting challenge maybe is for flexibility in more normal ranges. How can we do that? Sometimes it's just a matter of changing the packaging. And that would reduce waste a lot. So recommendations in this section: collaboratively deciding on reasonable lead times, longer where possible, reducing last minute order changes where possible, reviewing requirements on accepted size and shapes of product to reduce waste and financial loss. Interesting case study that I use in the report is I wrote a report a few years ago for Marks and Spencer's on a particular project they were doing with fair trade and Kenya bean suppliers. And through talking with the buyers and the suppliers together, they changed the packaging from a very restricted, solid packaging to a bag, which just meant that they could be a bit more flexible in the lengths of beans. I mean, such a simple idea, right? And it meant the actual loss, the actual waste of a bean that was slightly too long or too short was massively reduced. Nice innovation. So also reviewing the processes to reduce volatility of orders where possible. And being aware of this specific issue in terms of edge of season risks, keeping communication open with suppliers, being aware of that and providing flexibility where possible. And another very practical solution was around pre-vetting additional suppliers for contingency to avoid last minute orders and spot purchasing. And the last area will combine principle 4 and 5 together: payment terms and pricing. So where there are longer payment terms, more than 65 days, this is a massive issue for suppliers on cash flow. A lot of people talked about this in the interviews, that they have the grower and logistics costs are being paid months before the customer payment was received. And suppliers fed back that UK retailers have longer payment terms than EU. And this was actually one of the situations in which some suppliers were saying, we're trying to reduce selling to the UK because of some of these issues, which is, I think, a bit of an alarm bell that we need to listen to. That some suppliers were saying, yeah, we prefer to supply to some of the more stable EU retailers because of some of these issues, particularly around price and payment terms. So all the suppliers mentioned price pressure as increased in the last few years, but they have increased costs and inflation, climate changes, labour. I mean, particularly this year, mad changes in their costs. And they did mention that European discount stores and UK supermarkets are hardest on pricing. And another issue, particularly on pricing, is that human rights improvements and standards are not reflected in pricing. An element that you'd have to read the report to dive into a bit is this whole issue around fixed versus variable price contracts. So where there's a fixed price contract, it's agreed at the beginning of the year and it's set for the whole year. And it doesn't allow for suppliers to cover costs associated with fluctuating weather, labour or demand. And that seemed to be, from the feedback from the suppliers, more common with UK retailers. Whereas with some of the European retailers, they had contracts that allowed for some fluctuation of pricing, which allowed better production planning and cost recovery. So the buyers' perspectives, they agreed that yes, normally the agreements and contracts are for one season or 1 year. But they are having some examples of longer agreements. And payment terms, yes, it's true. The EU legislation on unfair trading practices, UTP, requires 30 days fresh. So the European supermarket in the group, for example, said they had to have a massive change of changing all of their payment terms from 60 days to 30 days when that law came in. but with the UK, often they're still on 60 days. So what were some of the recommendations that we made in this last section? A really significant one. It's really difficult, but it's a really significant one that makes a big difference to suppliers, is to commit to shorten the longer payment terms. Ideally, reducing the payment terms of 65 days plus to 30 to 40 days, in line with better practice in the fresh produce sector and in line with those EU laws, even if you're not in the jurisdiction of them. So avoiding aggressive price negotiation strategies and unjustified price reductions, understanding and moving towards prices that are sufficient to support responsible production and decent wages, and building pricing structures that support improvements in human rights performance, and potentially looking at reviewing that model of a fixed price contract to allow some variable price. So, whistle stop tour, forgive me for speaking fast. Whistle stop tour, we're now going to have a bit of a panel, but we are going to be kicked off by Danny, Danny Miles from ETI, who's going to give us a bit of a retailer perspective. Over to you, Danny. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Hilary. Yeah, look, everyone, unfortunately, I can't stay for all the session, but I did want to really come and just and say a few words and hopefully share some of my perspective. So glad we got time to do that. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the head of collective action at ETI. I've been here for about 2.5 years, but prior to that, I ran the human rights program at a UK supermarket. So I was directly involved with ETI's GMA project, the base of this report, in Spain and Italy during my time there. And this required, look, quite a lot, actually, sometimes in the first time of engagement with commercial teams, with specific fresh produce buyers, technical teams, to really help them understand the importance of this work and the role that commercial colleagues in particular can play to support the implementation of not just effective grievance mechanisms, but also drive improvement and the wider human rights risks in the sector. And I think the fresh produce context, particularly of today's session, is really important and definitely different to lots of the other food categories that I would work with. So I thought maybe helpful to share, some of that perspective, and quite a lot will echo what we've just heard from Hilary and what's in the report. But I can't confirm if it was unique to where I worked, but my experience was that the fresh produce teams were generally possibly more engaged on the conditions in their supply chains and had a good understanding of the challenges faced by growers, even if it was difficult then to adapt to them. But they also tended to move around a lot less. I mean, Hilary quite rightly mentions the point around buyer fluctuations. It was typical at certain times in my career for buyers to move every 6 months, and then it was all about driving margin and improvement in that category when you moved. So that led to poor practices. But then, look, most retailers also have on the ground colleagues, technical colleagues around the world. So they're regularly visiting farms, reporting back, and that really improves the link between those growers and their UK head office and brand retailer contacts. So it's a really positive step, I think. But look, buyers clearly in this sector and this category have to manage significant challenges that don't necessarily apply elsewhere. You've got a huge unpredictability in terms of yield, quality, forecasting, fluctuating impacts and labor costs, really complex supply chains in some cases with lots of intermediaries. And really, again, this climate element to this, irregular and erratic weather that really impacts the product itself, all of which led to the need, I think, to maintain a really high number of not just primary, but also secondary contact suppliers, contingency supply sources that we heard from then. It makes it really hard to get an accurate picture at any one time of who's actually supplying and assess the conditions at those site levels before you make that purchase. And I think we had more than 10,000 growers at any one time we were trying to manage compared to, let me think, probably about 1,800 manufacturers across the entire own brand estate in the rest of the business. So it's a vast and challenging category to work with. And as ever, so much of the risk and responsibility is pushed down the supply chains by companies. In the case of growers, I think this is even more impactful. Clearly, they're less well equipped to manage the demands, operating on really thin margins, limited control of cost fluctuations. And this often takes place without any commitments to them to longer term purchasing or reward for the supply or delivery of those kind of human rights ambitions of their retailer. So what we've seen today and what you'll see when you read the report is highlighting a prevalence of really poor practices that can go on in terms of last minute changes to orders, inaccurate forecasting, aggressive price negotiation with that real power imbalance, longer payment terms, and this all negatively impacts workers and the growers themselves, right? But I think there is another way, and again, who touched on that, some examples you'll find in the report, but the supermarket that I worked at did trial and implement a new sourcing model and a support package for UK farmers, UK particular. I think it's easier to get that off the ground. I can't take credit for this, by the way. It wasn't my idea, but it happened whilst I was there. But that included the introduction of multi-year contracts to increase certainty for farmers. And critically, I think, an agreement to underwrite 100% of the costs associated with growing the crops, which massively helps to mitigate the cost pressures that kind of come with the peaks and troughs of the season and challenges that farmers face. And this has not been rolled out across the board. It's been limited to the UK so far, but it shows what can be done if you're prepared to make that investment. And changes like this clearly can have a massive impact on farmers, growers, ultimately help support a more sustainable and viable supply relationship. And hopefully this is the direction of travel. Hilary touched on it again briefly, that supply chain security and long-term viability is going to be critical to all of the larger supermarkets going forward. So that might start to shift the power imbalance in favour of the growers at some point. But ultimately, better purchasing practices are clearly beneficial to all parties involved. And from our perspective at ETI, clearly have a key role to play in improving conditions for workers on a lasting basis. So, sorry, I'll get to the end, quickly summarise. But I guess on my experience, a few things I think could definitely help. Shorter payment terms, fundamentally. I mean, especially for smaller growers. And a lot of this was trialled, I think, with suppliers during COVID, so it can clearly be done. Longer term, multi-year contracts that enable forward planning, again, a no-brainer. And these flexible pricing models that adapt to whole season costs and acknowledge the risk and take on that risk that is typically placed on growers. And finally, I think, as Hilary noted really well, underpinning all of this is a need for much more effective incentivization of buyers. The conventional models based on margin, profit, availability, short lead time, etc., ultimately just lead to a race for the lowest price point, regardless of impact on workers. And that is something that needs to be addressed. In my experience, buyers will react to that. If you can find the right measure and reward that supply chain improvement, then buyers will react positively. We've all got a role to play in developing this, and the framework, the RPP framework that you've heard about, is an excellent basis for how this can be collectively improved. And we're not going to get the answers today. I don't think, not all the answers anyway, but I'm sure you're going to get some really great insight from the next panel. You've got some excellent speakers, and I really encourage all of you on the call today to think carefully about how you can be an advocate for change in this space. We all can contribute towards this. I think that's it for me. I won't go on too long, and I'll hand you back to Hilary's capable hands. I think you're going to lead the panel session, Hilary. So,
Yeah.
but if any of you want to reach out to me afterwards to continue the conversation, please do so.
Brilliant, Danny. We really appreciate you joining us today. Hugely. Thank you. Thank you. So we have Carlos and David with us for the panel. I'd like to welcome both of them. Carlos is a sociologist and political scientist, specialized in human rights and corporate social responsibility, and a PhD candidate in migration studies and international cooperation for development at a university in Madrid. He works as a project lead and social researcher in the private sector team at Oxfam Spain. And he's been focusing on labour migration and agriculture value supply chains. So yeah, his research is super relevant to our report. So welcome, Carlos. Thank you so much for being here. And then I'll also introduce David at the start of this panel. David is a corporate relations director at Prince's Group. He's responsible at Prince's for environmental and social sustainability, external communications and public affairs, and has been working in this area for nearly 15 years. He has been heavily involved in Prince's management of Italian tomato supply chain, tongue twister for us, for over a decade, and is familiar with the challenges of human rights in Italian agriculture. Yeah, he has such practical knowledge to share with us. So thank you both for being here. I'd love to start with you, Carlos. I wonder if you could summarize, what are the working conditions like in Italy and Spain for fresh produce and ambient supply chains? Give us a bit of a picture of what people's lives are like.
Okay, hi everyone. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to take part of this discussion. It is a pleasure to participate in the presentation of such an important and necessary report. Regarding the question, I will focus mainly on Spain because it is the context I know best, but I will also make some links with Italy, of course. I think the first point is that fresh produce and ambient food supply chains are not just business chains. They are built on the daily lives of workers, many of them migrants, who make it possible for fruits and vegetables to reach supermarkets across Europe. In Spain, intensive agriculture in areas such as Huelva, Almería, and Murcia, South Spain, depends heavily on migrant workers from a wide range of backgrounds. This includes, for example, Moroccan women recruited through the Hiring at Origin program, Romanian and other Eastern European workers, workers from Senegal, Mali, and of course other African countries, and also Latin American workers, among many other nationalities. This group are not all in the same situation. Some arrive through formal recruitment programs, others are already in Spain, sometimes with unstable or irregular legal status, and move between different farming seasons looking for work. In Italy, there is also a strong dependence of migrant workers in fruit, vegetables, supply chains in general. Workers may come from North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Europe, and in some regions from India. A key issue in Italy is the role of labor intermediaries, especially the system known as caporalato. This is when informal or illegal labor brokers, known as caporali, recruit workers for farm. They may organize transport, decide who gets work, control communication with employers, and sometimes influence housing too. Workers may have to pay them for transport or access to work or lose part of their daily wage to them. This creates a very strong dependence. It can also make workers afraid to complain because the same person who gives them access to work can also exclude them from it. This is important because caporalato is not only about individual abuse. It is also linked to the way the sector needs very cheap and very flexible labor at short notice. When producers need workers quickly, for example, because of urgent order or harvest pressure, these intermediaries can become more powerful in this sense. So what are worker lives like day to day? In many cases, they start very early. Workers may live far from towns in housing provided by the employer, share containers, overcrowded houses sometimes, or informal settlements. 12,000 people live in informal settlements in Huelva and Almería, southern Spain. Transport can be difficult as well, expensive or dependent on employers of intermediaries. Access to healthcare shops or public services in general also can be limited. Once at work, the job is physically very hard. In berry production, for example, workers spend many hours spent over repeating the same movement, carrying boxes and working under a strong pressure to be fast. In plastic tunnel, for example, or greenhouses, heat can be intense. In packing facilities, warehouses, workers may avoid outdoor heat, yes, but they often spend long hours standing, doing repetitive tasks and working in cold rooms. So the main problem are not only low salaries or long hours, although they are very important. The problem are also about exhaustion, health, housing, transportation, isolation, dependence on the employer, and fear sometimes. Workers describe back pain, tiredness, heat stress, skin problems linked to the chemicals, lack of proper rest, unpaid or underpaid overtime, wage deductions, verbal pressure from supervisors, and problems accessing healthcare. For some groups, dependence is the central issue. In Spain, workers hired at origin may depend on the same employer for their contract, income, and housing, and future recruitment. Even with the legal contract, it can be very hard to complain if they fear not to be called again next season. In Italy, caporalato or other labor intermediaries can create a similar or even stronger dependence, especially when they control recruitment, transport, and access to work, as I said before. Women can also face a specific risk. So Moroccan women hired at origin and women in very precarious situations may face isolation, harassment, gender-based control, or greater dependence on supervisors and employees. This is why we need to understand and safety in a broad way. It's not only about accidents, it's also about the social and living conditions that shape workers' health and well-being. We cannot hear you, Hilary.
What do you think? Are some of the purchasing practices of buying companies that might be contributing to some of these issues? What do you think?
Yeah, I will not say that purchasing practices are the only cause of poor working condition. Producers and employers have legal duties. Public authorities, labor inspection, and migration policy, of course, also matter. But purchasing practices are very important driver because they shape the pressure that moves down the chain. The first problem is price pressure. In my opinion, if producers are expected to sell at very low prices while also meeting strict social, environmental, and certification requirements, there is a contradiction here. Someone has to absorb that pressure. Very often, it is absorbed through labor, more temporary work, faster work rhythms, unpaid overtime, less investment in housing, etc. The second problem I will highlight is last-minute order, short lead times, and poor forecasting. Fresh produce is perishable, as everybody know. When orders change suddenly, producers need workers immediately, as already mentioned, sometimes only for a short period. This creates problems, no? This creates demand for extremely flexible workforce. In practice, this can mean longer hours, more pressure on workers, informal hiring, or greater reliance on intermediaries, for example, in Italy, as we said before, with the caporalato. The third problem I will highlight is strict quality and appearance standards. When we talk sometimes with some of the companies that produce the fruits and vegetables, they highlight this. No, if the product must be perfect, if rejection risks are high, or if delivery windows are very narrow, pressure increase on farms and in packing houses. So this pressure arrives at the end to the worker who is working in the farm. Finally, I would like to highlight the codes of conduct. Audits and certification are important, but they are not enough in the commercial model. In the commercial, no, buyers should go beyond asking suppliers to meet the standard and documentation requirements. They should also take responsibility for changing the purchasing practices to create pressure, such as low prices or poor forecasting, short lead times, and stable contracts. To conclude, poor working conditions are not only a farm level problem, they are also a value chain problem. Responsible purchasing should be part of human rights due diligence. It means paying prices that reflect the real cost of decent work, improving forecasting, reducing last-minute changes, sharing risk more fairly, building longer relationship with suppliers, and making sure workers have safe and independent ways to raise the concerns.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Carlos. I'm going to pass over to David now. Princes has been working very hard to improve working conditions for suppliers and for workers in their supply chains in Europe for quite some time. We include a case study on good practice from Princes within the report. So David has a lot of experience on this. So having read the report, David, and from your personal experience, what do you think are some of the key pressure points where the practices of buyers most impact suppliers and workers?
Thank you, Hilary, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I think there's a few things in there. For me, it starts really with what you described as the internal integration. And it already starts there. If responsible purchasing practices aren't really embedded at that start point, then you're going to falter or fail or have negative consequences on your journey. So that could be inexperience of the buyer or buying team, a lack of knowledge, or a solely commercial focus. Now, I'm not criticizing, by the way, the retailers on the call. That applies absolutely to companies like mine and processors like mine. And I'll perhaps overly transparently give you an example in terms of this journey we've been on. When Princes first bought the factory in Italy, which we still have today in Foggia, that produces tomatoes, I wasn't aware of this issue, and customers, probably some of whom are on this call, brought it to my attention. I went to see the managing director and he said, "Oh, go and speak to," I won't say his name, "our buyer. He's been buying tomatoes for 20 years. He'll know all about it." And I went to see him. He knew nothing about it. So that's absolutely not the position in our business today. Buyers in these areas are in a very different place. But that internal embedding is critical for all of us, wherever the procurement sits. The lack of long-term contracts is a factor that's been raised a lot in this and many other conversations. In mine and Prince's experience, certainly in Italian tomatoes, this is changing, and it certainly has changed with many customers. But short-term commitment is still a factor here that's problematic. So there are things that we all as purchasers can do about that. But I was also sitting here thinking with my environmental hat on, wondering if net zero will change our approach on that one. If we all want to decarbonize our chains by 2050, it's going to be very difficult if we keep jumping from country to country or supplier to supplier. So maybe net zero actually might be a bigger contributing factor in terms of that longer term commitment. There's also an issue for all of us in terms of a sort of a lack of understanding of the cost of production, and that's hard enough normally, I think, in any year. Imagine the year we're in now in terms of the global situation in terms of fertilizer and energy costs. There will be growers who are facing a very uncertain few months, as we all are. I understand whether you're a retailer or a processor, who knows where our energy costs are at. And businesses like mine, and I guess our customers, look at sort of global indices and global market reports all the time when you're benchmarking prices. But in terms of these products that we're talking about, I don't think you can really say I'm going to pay X because another country is selling at Y. It doesn't really work that way, especially from a human rights lens. So a better understanding of the cost of things and better benchmarking within businesses, I think, would be particularly important. And again, I certainly stress to retailers on the call, please don't think I'm speaking at you. I'm reflecting back on my own businesses here. My own business here, it's important. And then the links a little bit to the contract point, but that commitment and clarity. I was listening with interest with some of the comments, which I think were directed a bit more at the fresh chain, and I'm in ambient, but I might talk about that a bit more later because there's not that much difference between them. We have less of that short-term changing of volumes. Usually in a supply of canned tomato, a customer will say, "I want X," and that's it. It won't change. It won't change for the year. So I think it's probably a bit less so for us. But the thing that we also do need to bear in mind with growers is when you get to the end of season, as I think was touched on, the variable, certainly in terms of Italian tomatoes, once harvest starts in, give or take, mid-July, there will be variables in terms of the crop quality. There will be variables in terms of the weather. It does rain in Italy in the summer from time to time. And that's something we need to bear in mind. Now, that can actually play, in our experience, quite well for growers. If growers have spare tomatoes and it's a short season, they can sell on an open market and probably do very well in terms of selling to the highest bidder. But it's our responsibility, I think, for all of us to consider what's the converse of that. If a grower has excess tomatoes in a plentiful season, they still need a fair return on them. And if they're squeezed and the tomatoes are still on the plants, there's only one place a grower's going to save money, and it's in the labour for the harvest. There's nowhere else to go. So if a grower in that situation is being really squeezed, it's almost an invitation to exploitation at that stage.
Thank you so much, David. Really appreciate that. Going back to Carlos, is there anything particularly that you noticed in the report that you just really want people to take notice of?
Yes, thank you. What I will really highlight from the report is the main idea. The human rights due diligence cannot remain separate from commercial decision making. Of course, producers and employers have direct responsibility for respect to labor rights and ensuring decent working conditions, but buying companies also need to look at their own role, because their purchasing practices can create or increase pressure in the supply chain. It is not enough for companies to have a strong sustainability policies, code of conduct, audits, or suppliers requirements if daily buying decisions continue to create pressure through low prices, short lead times, unstable contracts, or last-minute order changes in general. Due diligence should shape the way companies decide on prices, volumes, lead times, product specification, and contracts. For me, one of the most important messages is that buyers should not only focus on supplier compliance. If supermarkets ask suppliers to meet higher labor, social, and environmental standards, but at the same time continue with purchasing practices that make those standards harder to achieve, then due diligence risks becoming just another, let's say, extra pressure for suppliers. So I think the key point is that responsible purchasing is part of human rights due diligence. This does not remove responsibility from producers or employees. It means that buyers also have a role in creating the commercial conditions that make decent work possible. That means asking very practical questions. Are our prices realistic? Are our forecasts reliable? Are our lead time reasonable? Are our contracts stable enough? Or are our giving suppliers the condition they need to support decent work? For me, that is one of the strongest points of the report. Improving working conditions is not only about monitoring supplies better, it's also about making sure that commercial practices do not undermine the labor standard that companies say they want to protect. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Carlos. And David, anything else you want to highlight from the report?
Yeah, a couple of things. One of the things that jumped out for me, sadly, was the reluctance still to speak from growers. Disappointing. This is certainly, in my experience, a very well documented, well publicized, well talked about issue. You would think that there would be no fear, but there clearly still is. So that's disappointing. I would also add that, while there's a certain element of negativity to the conversation, but let's be a bit more positive. It does highlight the report that there's some really good examples of buying behavior in all sides of the chain. So let's celebrate that. There are some really progressive companies out there, both processors and retailers, doing good things and making a real difference. So it's not about success today. It's about a journey of continuous improvement. And then I also note as well, in terms of legislation, and I think somebody mentioned earlier on the UTP at an EU level, and I suppose I'm reflecting on that in terms of my comment of the fear of growers. It's an interesting piece of legislation. I honestly don't know how often it's used. Candidly, I'll say that we as Princes in 2024 thought very, very long and hard about using that with a particular European retailer, being as generic as I can and not to give anybody any worries or get me into trouble. We thought very long and hard about it, but actually thought it's not really worth the hassle or the repercussions over it. So I've mentioned the fear. My company has that fear too. From a commercial point of view. So the legislation is there, but I worry a little bit about how much it's being used.
Yeah, super interesting. And just to end us off on this panel, David, I'd love for you to conclude about what do you think some of the things that buyers in retailers and tier one suppliers could do, practical steps they can take to mitigate some of these possible negative impacts on suppliers and workers that we've discussed?
Okay, well, a little bit of a repetition, perhaps, one of my earlier answers in terms of the internal embedding, but education and understanding is critical here, I think. I and my colleagues in our ESG team here are frequently using a statement that we're thinking of having T-shirts printed when we talk to our procurement team. You buy it, you own it. So if that means that there's sustainability challenges or exploitation or human rights abuse, it's on you. Now that's a bit far. We work very collaboratively with our colleagues, but to try and get them to think about that a little bit more, they are buying this product and responsible for bringing it in. So I do think it's very important for people in procurement role, whether you're in a business like mine or whether you're at a retailer, to really understand the nuances of what you're buying and the variables involved. I'm reminded earlier on, we were talking away here about fresh and ambient chains, but ultimately, if you think about it, they're all fresh chains. This is where they all start. So there isn't really any differential in some respects, other than, I guess, ambient foods and canned foods, as my businesses are mostly, tend to be highly commoditized, whereas fresh versions tend to attract a bit more of a premium. But ultimately, how they get out of the ground into whether it's a fresh piece of packaging or the can. It all starts the same, broadly speaking. So there are obviously differences there in terms of supply chain and distribution, but all generally with the same origin. I would say one of the most important ones, and this is one that we at Princes feel very passionate about, is about pre-selection. Um, in my role and my team's role, we have things to fill in for our sales team, 20 things a week in terms of competitive tenders, fill in this document, and we're very happy to do that. Well, I don't love filling them in. We've got other things to do, but we happily fill them in knowing that our customers are asking these questions, which is really important. But I personally believe for certainly for retailers and the same for our business, when you're going into a competitive tender, you really should be very clear in the 2, 3, 4, whatever it is, suppliers who are going to win this and that you want to work with. Undertake your due diligence and eliminate suppliers before you get to start asking for prices. No stalking horses really should be in the mix in terms of competitive tenders. It doesn't tend to end well. And compliant or progressive businesses, in our experience, they're more likely to regress in terms of what they're doing rather than be proactive if they're asked to match unrealistic prices or match up against suppliers who aren't doing the same things. So again, that's not a little bit perhaps aimed at retailers there. I promise you in a collaborative way, but very much aimed at my business as well. I think we're better at this now and pretty good, but we could certainly improve. And then I suppose the other one I would think, and this is much more easily said than done. I appreciate boots on the ground don't half help. I've been lucky enough over the years to go to southern Italy during harvest and outside of harvest with many customers, and over the years, predominantly with responsible sourcing personnel. But less frequently with commercial personnel, and I realise how busy everyone is, so I do get that. But I can certainly assure you, from my perspective, that standing in a field in Italy at 7:45 in the morning and it's 35 degrees already gives you a very different thought process in terms of protecting workers picking these things.
So let's have a look at whether anyone wants to ask any questions to our panel. Do drop a question in the chat if you would like to ask a question to the panel before we move on to breakout groups. So I really appreciate Carlos and David, your time, and also Danny. I think he's had to dash off. He's a busy man. But super helpful to have a kind of retailer perspective from Danny, and then the kind of researcher perspective from Carlos and tier one supplier from David. Thank you so much for your perspectives.